Hi, my name is Dr. Jason Mendez. My pronouns are he, him, his. I identify as Boricua. My family is from, my mother's side is from Ay Bonito, Puerto Rico. My father's side is from Moca, Puerto Rico. Migrated to the Bronx. So, I say that my family's from the South Bronx in addition to Puerto Rico. I speak a little bit of Spanish, mostly English. And this is what looking bilingual means to me.
First of all, tell me about your kids.
Yeah, my kids, I have three children. My oldest is my son, Kyron Antonio. He actually turns 15 in a couple weeks,
Oh
which
my
is
God.
weird to say, having a 15-year-old. And I have two younger daughters. My oldest daughter, Audra Nasuda, she is 12. And then I know your younger daughter is Audra as well. And then my youngest is Leilani Denai, and she'll be 10. Now that they're getting like teens, it's kind of like, they're starting to remember more of like the things that we do, as a family. They kind of bring those things up, later on. Like, hey, do you remember those things? And some of the stuff kind of shocks me, like, wow, those things that impacted them that they kind of bring
Yeah.
up, reminiscing.
Oh my God. And something you talked about that I loved was that you said that the kids have watched both you and your wife professionally throughout the years. And again, now that they're remembering more, that must be even more impactful. So, how do you think that impacted their perception of their life and of their identities?
My wife and I have this conversation often, in the fact that we both come from working class families. So I grew up in the South Bronx, Hunts Point section of the South Bronx. She grew up where we live now in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so, working class families, like I mentioned earlier, my family migrated from Puerto Rico to the Bronx. Yeah, so, watching us coming from a working class background, like I didn't really see I knew what my parents did for work, but I wasn't involved in like the day-to-day process of what it meant for them to kind of like go to work. Like we lived in the Bronx, but they worked in the city. My father was a plumber, his father was a plumber, my mother worked in a chiropractic office. So although they were working class, like they lived in the city, like thinking back, like I didn't understand quite in terms of like, socioeconomic status. Like we lived in the Bronx, like in one of the poorest congressional districts in the nation with Hunts Point, but it never felt that way growing up. Um, and so for my kids, I'm curious like how they kind of interpret like, watching us grow up. Like they're more involved in like the development of our careers. So like, we're both academics. And so they've traveled us to conferences and they've seen what that life is like as a professor. They've seen, my wife being part, organizing focus groups and doing her research studies. And so like it's become just like that's what mom does in a sense. And like with me, with my academic career, they've kind of seen that, but they've also seen me transition and leaving academia to pursue my passions in artistry. Wanting to be a poet, wanting to be a writer, wanting to be a playwright, performer. So they've seen me walk away from academia and now
Mm,
pursue these other artistry,
you.
in a way where like it felt like this is what you almost like you dedicated so much in school for, and you've built like over 10 plus years in academia. But it was also for my own kids to see like, hey, when this doesn't sit well with you, there's a level of integrity that I want you to have to like just walk away from it. And
Yeah.
it was an example that I wanted them to see. So for me, there was so much of an inspiration because I'm like, if my kids came to me when they were older and they had the same type of situation I was going through, what advice would I give them? And so I would tell them like, just get up out of there. So how can I give them advice if I wasn't willing to do that? Because my background's in education, because I was in schools education, and so I think now that my kids navigate school, as Afro Latino, Afro Boricua kids in school, especially in a place like Pittsburgh, where like that's an anomaly in the schools that they're in. So they rarely get to see themselves in
Yeah.
like the curriculums that they have in schools. Like, I always would joke, but it's the truth where, the only time, my kids' school would do Hispanic Heritage Month is when I would actually come in to do something for my
No.
and so, but that was part of, I think, their experience, so that they would remember like, my dad used to come in because it was absent in here. So they don't understand like the significance of it maybe now, but as they get older, then they'll realize like now I understand like every Hispanic Heritage Month, like why he was there doing what he did and reading the stuff and bringing the text that he was doing.
Being an educator actually goes back in your family. Was it
It
your
does.
grandmother?
Yeah, my mother's mother, Virginia Malave Rivera, when she moved to the Bronx, she worked in the public schools, and so she was a special education teacher. But from what they told me, special education back when she taught was ESL, what we would kind of call it today. The experience that she had as a teacher, seeing the difficulty that students had navigating, she didn't want me to experience those particular politics in school. And so that's why like I'm not fluent in Spanish. So it
Mhm.
wasn't because I just didn't learn, but that was an intentional move that was made at home for me to learn English as a way to kind of be successful in navigating, school. But then you think about it, like it's something that was lost that now that I'm older, like I wish I had that native tongue a little bit more because now that I have kids, I want them to have that. And so they're missing it. And it's like collectively as a family, we're trying to like go back to that native tongue and learn together and be fluent and speak Spanish. But it was really cool this past summer. We were in Puerto Rico, and my youngest daughter, she was playing with a couple of kids who didn't speak any English. And so when they walked away and they were done playing, she asked me like, "Hey, how long would it take for me to learn Spanish?" And I'm like,
Yep.
it's really on to you, depending how much time you invest in wanting to learn. But it was really a proud moment in the sense where I think beyond learning Spanish in school, like she really saw like what the need was to be able to build with like kids that she just wanted to build with. And it was really proud too because it wasn't how come they don't speak English in a sense. It was like, how do I learn Spanish to communicate with them? So, it was just little moments of like that where I'm like, oh man, like, proud dad moments of like seeing what was going on in that moment
And that
in a
goes
sense. But
back
I
to
think
what you're saying. Yes, like those
yeah.
things that you're teaching them, even through your actions, like clearly you and your wife and the people around you are not judging people in that way. And you guys, it sounds like you guys enter rooms with curiosity. It sounds like, there's, like you said, there's this reclamation you're almost trying to do to reclaim that language. Have you shared with your kids about your grandmother's experience and that that's why you don't know Spanish?
No, we've never had that conversation
Oh.
about that. So my son has met that particular grandmother, but he was a baby.
While obviously now we are like, no, you screaming into the past, teach them Spanish, right? Like we're, hindsight's 2020, but you have to respect the fact that she was watching out. And like a lot of people, this story is so common. She did it because she loved you all and she cared. And she was like, oh no, right now, with the knowledge I have, the tools I've got, I need
Mhm.
to protect my family. And that's history that, while it's a shame, in one way that she was forced to make that kind of decision, in another way, it's an honorable thing to be like, okay, but now we're reclaiming because now the world has changed. Oh, you need to tell them that story.
I know you inspire me to tell them more of those stories. We have tons of photographs. I'm very OCD when it comes to like collecting photos and organizing them. Because my mom has all these photographs that are just in bins. Like there's no categorization, no organization
Yes.
of where they just exist in all these bins. But I have all these digitized photos that I organize them by folders, by year, by moments. So when they get, my age and they want something, they can look back and they find these memories, and then, as a writer, they'll be able to attach some of these stories to some of these photographs and just have a collective memory. I think we talked about before just about it's very different in like how our kids are growing up, where growing up in the Bronx, like I had all my cousins, my grandparents, I lived in the same house, one of those private homes with my grandmother who I was telling you about. We lived on the second floor, she lived on the first. My uncle, her son, lived on the third floor, and she rented out the basement area. But my father's family, they lived, directly right across the street, and so everyone was, like in just proximity of one another. So we had these collective memories as a family. But now with my own kids, it's like they rarely see cousins except for like holidays or big events. But because we live in Pittsburgh and my family's kind of like spread out, in New York, but then more folks kind of left as well. Like they rarely see like my side of the family, as well. So they have cousins and titis and tios that like they don't know exist in a sense, just because due to proximity. So, part of that, hurts in a sense of like, I wonder if they're missing out on a particular childhood that I remember and love so dearly. Or maybe like this is just their story and like, what they'll cherish as they get older. You know, I don't know.
I mean, this is a question that I have too, because I have a similar situation. And also, I think, and maybe I mentioned this in our previous conversation, like, even in my generation, that detachment had already started. And I was
Right.
kind of born intergenerationally because my mom was a young mom. And so like I had two other cousins that were my age and they were nearby, but it was strange that like just the relationship at that point because nobody expected those three kids to pop up in the moment that they did because they were either born to really old parents or really young parents. So it was a weird time. And so I didn't have that cousin collective that like most Latinos have because I was
Right.
intergenerational. And whoever came afterwards was like 10 plus years. So it just didn't feel the same anymore. And so it's funny now that I have a daughter, and actually, even before I was thinking about this for a very long time, I was like, how can I give my future children that experience that even I didn't have?
Yeah.
Not fully. And so but you want to kind of, I'm like, I feel like we're starting from like ground zero with
Mhm.
our like little nest and with our traditions and trying to like pull together people that have even like you said, physically separated so much. Like who's over here, who's over there. With my partner's family, they're in Pennsylvania or in Texas, people that he doesn't even know anymore. So it's kind of like how do you build forward while respecting and honoring the past? I don't have an answer. I'm just saying
Yeah.
have the
I
structure.
think that's such I think for us though, like those things that happened organically, I think we become a little bit more intentional of how we structure like certain moments for our kids. And it's like, for example, like um earlier, beginning of December, we went to Philly. I have an organization, Black Chronicles, and we started the Pittsburgh Latinx Artist Residency Program. And so, we support 5 artists for this 10-month residency, and we do this opening retreat. And this year, in our second year, we went out to Philly. And so we were at Taller Puertorriqueño.
Yes.
We had a couple of Boricua artists who came in, Dr. Reina Leon, poet. She came in and talked about her work, and then we had Alyssa. Oh, I'm blanking on the name. Hold on, I'm gonna get it so I can show her book.
Yeah.
Yes, right here. Alyssa Reynoso Morris. The Bronx is my home,
Oh my gosh.
and then Platanos are love. Here, and so I saw her on Instagram, and so I was like, oh, the first book I saw was this one. Oh, excuse me. The Bronx, and because of that, I'm from the South Bronx. Just because it said Bronx, I was like, all right, I'm buying it. Then I was like, and then I saw she was based in Philly, so I was like, hey, do you want to be one of our guest speakers? And so she came and was sharing with the artist. But what I noticed while she was speaking was my youngest daughter, Leilani, in the corner reading this book while she was speaking. And I remember now that you talk about stuff that they'll remember, like
Yeah.
they're gonna remember like we went to Philly, we had that guest speaker, whatever my dad does with these artists. And it's but as they get older, then they'll realize like, wow, my father and like his colleagues, like they created a whole like Latinx artist residency program that never existed in Pittsburgh, that's now supporting like the entire Southwest region of Pennsylvania. Like now it's expanded, like we're expanding now in the Bronx and out in LA. So it's kind of like these things that become the norm for them that like I just never experienced in terms of possibilities like when I was a kid,
Right.
in that sense. Like the organization Black Chronicles, we did a gala event back in November, like my first gala event. And my
Yeah.
youngest daughter, like she was there with her little friends and they were on the dance floor dancing. And like you got Tony Touch DJing and like, he's coming
That's
behind the
right.
turntables. He's coming behind the turntables with his phone, recording them because he's probably never seen little kids at the kind of parties and events that he does, jamming while he's on on stage. And for them, they're dancing, having no clue who Tony Touch is. I'm like, yo, this is such an iconic moment, for both of these folks. But
Yeah.
for them, the next day, my daughter was like, "Oh, you should have another gala. That was fun." And I'm like, "It's not just like a regular house party. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it costs a
She's
lot of
like,
money,
let's do that
takes
again.
a lot of time." But I think for them, what was really proud moment was they see what's possible. Like for them, like a gala, like, all right, my dad throws galas. Like that's the norm in a sense. For them watching me like organize and being kind of like speaking at the gala, like for them I'm just dad in a sense. And so for them to dream of what's possible, and like this is how you manifest it, and like don't let anyone else you know shit on your dreams or say like it's not possible or this, that, and the other. Like if you want something, like just go after
Words.
it. Like
But you talked about like part of maybe the shame or kind of like the ah darn is that they're not gonna get that block experience like you did. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think about them because they have like their school friends.
Yeah.
Where we live is an older community, and even in the other places we live, but there wasn't like a neighborhood kids. Like they don't have like their crew, or
Hmm.
like how I had my crew. Like I had my school friends, and when I got to the block, like this was my crew. But having these adventures as a group, and like that was what just made us tight, where we're still brothers, even though like I haven't seen them physically in like 20 something, 30. I mean, since I was 13 years old. Like I'm 44 now, so 30 years.
Yeah.
You since been on the block with them, but like it's like it just never ended, with that group of guys on there. And what's really dope about them is like they'll share stories with me as a writer where I'm writing these stories and I'm like, did I make this up? And then they'll say something that I'm like, no, it did happen. And they remember it and they love those memories just as much as I do. And I want my kids to have like that, like those
Yeah.
memories where you're like, it's the Bronx and things. But I was like, man, it's a beautiful struggle, but it was just a beautiful childhood that I remember, and that I want them to have that same experience.
And it's funny, after you told me that, I was like, I completely understand what he's saying. And I was like, and I wonder, because I have similar, my version of that. And I wonder, and then I look at my mom's story and her friends' stories, and I'm just like, oh, I didn't get that experience, but I'm like, but I got this one. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, will our kids be like, yeah, I love my dad's stories. I love my mom's story. I love these stories, and here's my story. And maybe that's, so maybe they'll have a little bit of like cariño or something for hours in a way that's kind of like, oh, I wish I could have lived that. But then they'll turn around, they'll be like, but here's mine. And it'll just like continue.
They have those stories, so it's kind of funny. I think we were mentioning, I see if you knew what Breaking Night was, but like in the Bronx, like Breaking Night was
That's
just
right.
like when we would just stay up late until the sun came up, right? You see night break, in a sense. And I
Yeah.
just always thought it was so poetic and beautiful now that I look back at the language we had to describe these moments. But as kids, when they were younger, like they necessarily didn't break night, but they were staying up super late where my wife would be like, it's time for them to kind of like go to bed and wrap it up. But for me, I remember like those times were so sacred, and like I would hear them through the door of like having their own conversations. Because this is when all three of them would share a bedroom.
Mm.
Uh, and I realized like they're having their own moments and their own stories, and now they're having their own secrets that we don't know about, and like that's fine. Like let them go back when they're 30s and be like, hey, remember when we used to do this as kids that I didn't get a clue that they did. And it's kind of funny the other day, during the break when my son, because my son goes to boarding school now, and so he came back for the winter break, and we were talking about, we give these opportunities to share like whatever troops you have, you're not gonna get in trouble. So we were like, have you ever snooped through our bedroom? And because I'm like, I did as a kid, snoop through my parents' bedroom. And they were like, yeah, we have. And so it's kind of funny, like them disclosing like stuff that they've done. And
Ah,
it was kind of, kind of cool because I was telling you before, I was like, sometimes I just want them to go out and like get into something. Like there's certain trouble, like it's okay to get into. And
yes,
the sense of
yes.
like, have those memories and get into shit and like, have those stories where like we could have gotten in really trouble, but we got away with it in a sense. So like there's an old story like my friends and I have from the Bronx where we stole a box of donuts from the bodega. Like we had planned it out. Like it was Ocean's 11. And I'm sure like
Stop.
the store owner was like, I know what y'all doing in a sense. Yeah, you idiots. We had planned this out and we stole this big box of donuts. I can't tell you like what we did with the donuts after we stole them, like if we ate them or we threw them away because we were scared of having like evidence. But we all remember that moment, and it was just more of this collective memory of like we did this and we came together in a sense to kind of like do this plan. So it sounds so stupid, like stealing a box of donuts, but like it was
No,
just
I
a
love
really
it.
cool moment. You know what I mean? For us as kids, and I'm like, I want them to have those same kind of stories, when they get older.
I love that. No, I love that. I have such appreciation for that because while I was a little bit more square and that would have given me a heart attack, I think, but I had my versions of trouble that were just so much fun. And we have, yeah, when I think about my friends from childhood, like, and actually we just saw one of them, where she's my oldest, like standing friend, and we've known each other since we were like in the second grade, and we saw her recently. And what I love too is when your friends remember things from the same thing but from a slightly different perspective, and they say that, and they say it back to you, and you go, oh my god, I remember that now, or oh wow, I didn't think of it that way. And it's incredible how the different perspectives of like the same story can just like blow your mind or even
Yeah.
remind you of something. I mean, the things that people have remembered about like me or things that we've done together, I'm like, I have a really good memory. I'm very proud of my memory. And I'm like, and I do not remember that. And that's insane. And it tracks. And I believe you because it sounds like me. And, we just crack up. And I completely appreciate that. I wanted to wrap up with one of the stories or moments of your life that you explained when we served on a panel together,
Yeah.
that it just always stayed with me. And I told you, and I really mean this
Um,
from the bottom of my heart, like just like you explaining this, I was like, and maybe it's because you just have such a way with words, because it's also a beautiful story, because it's just so meaningful. But it's also one of the main reasons I was like, I know he's gonna have more stuff, but this is definitely one of the main reasons I wanted to be a part of this season. So it's it's the four generation. I think I'm getting this right. The
yeah, yeah.
four generations picture. Can you tell us
Yeah,
about?
I'll have to send you that picture. So if you want to post it when you
Yes, please do. Yes,
I'll
yes.
send it to you. So, actually, wait, hold I have this book right here. So, when I was in grad school at North Carolina Central University, I used to live on campus in their student, graduate housing. I don't know what prompted me to ask this question of myself, but I just stopped in the middle of my apartment and I was like, I don't know anything about being Puerto Rican or Boricua or like culture. Like I have the music and the CDs, I have the flag hanging in my car, I know how to make, a couple dishes here and there. But as far as like Boricua history and culture, like what does it actually mean to be Boricua? And so, I don't know if this still exists, but I went to like half.ebay.com to order, a book, and back in saving money, you order the used copies, back then because they were real, real cheap. The shipping costs more than the actual book itself. And the first one that caught my eye was this one called Boricua's Influential Puerto Rican Writings, an anthology edited by Roberto Santiago. And so it was this used book that I got, and I still have it. Pages are yellow and blue. I think there's some pages like even missing in here. But what stood out from this book, it was a library book from the Phoenix University. It's not Phoenix, Phoenix Public Library.
Yeah.
But on the other side of it, it's this. It may come up reverse because of the camera, but it says
Yeah.
discard
Yeah.
on here. So that always stood next to me in this idea of like our history and our culture just being discarded, or at least you know not really respected or valued in that way. So it really prompted something in me where I'm like, all right, I'm 20 something years old working on a master's in education, and like a lot of these artists in here, like I have no idea they ever existed. Especially being Boricua from the Bronx, you would think like I would be familiar with some of these folks, but I just didn't know any of these artists. Julia de Burgos, Piri Thomas, Pedro Petrie, Willie Perdomo, all these folks that like shared the similar experience that I had growing up, as this, New Yorican in a sense, that I just kind of made it like a life's purpose to be like, I want to collect as much information as possible. So someone else, these next generations of Boricuas coming up after me have like this database, a sense of like, these are all the folks that like you should know being a Boricua and connected to like our history and culture. And so that prompted me to want to work on this documentary film called Guaraguao. So Guaraguao is the Taino word for red-tailed hawk. I met kind of like a spiritual priest, Boricua, a Behiki is what it's called. And he drew this Guaragua symbol in this journal I have, and he shared with me that it means enlightenment, perspective, because the Guaragua flies above the tree, so it sees the bigger picture. The counterpart of that is the owl because it's in the trees, but it's more about introspection, just seeing what it's in front of us, having more soft eyes. And so I use this idea of Guadagua because I wanted to see this bigger story of this migration story of who we are as a people from, pre-colonialization to contemporary Boricua artists and really exploring the question of what it means to be Boricua. I always tell folks, like, when I tell my story, you just don't hear my story, but you hear my father's story, Jose Antonio Mendez. You hear his father's story, Ramon Antonio Mendez. These guys, this one guy who was a plumber, his father was a super plumber, and then you have their grandson who's like this poet playwright. Like, how did, this come about in a sense? But part of that was when we filmed in Puerto Rico. My grandfather's still living. He lives in Dorado. He moved back to, Puerto Rico. And so we did a photo shoot with him. We didn't really interview him. We just did a photo shoot. And so I took my son with us. And so there's this 4 generation picture that before my father died, he died of brain cancer back in 2009. It's actually coming up. His birthday is January 22nd. My son's birthday is January 25th. So it's always a reminder of, like, how long my son has, been alive, but then also, how long my father has not been around as well.
Yeah.
We're coming up on 15 years now.
Um,
And so, I always thought, like, I took these 3 generation photos when he was still alive. And I always thought when I had my son, like, we would do this 4 generation, not knowing how the story would unfold of him, going through brain cancer and then passing away. And so, by him being present in the photo, I took an old photograph of him and we took this 4 generation photo of me holding it up, with my son and then with my grandfather, along with his great grandson in a sense. And so it's just, this 4 generation story that captures so much about migration, about what is home, what is coming back home,
yeah.
how to keep these stories alive, them knowing who his father, my father was, and him knowing who his grandfather was. My father, was this big time basketball fan, not player, but fan. So seeing that my son has this passion, you see these little things in the universe that, like, man, they're connecting in a way that they've never, I mean, they met each other because he was a baby, but my son does not remember, my father, but there's these connections that he has, to him. My father's name is Jose Antonio. My son is Karen Antonio. So they share the same middle name. I didn't realize it, but my grandfather's Ramon Antonio. So that name Antonio is kind of like this generational, name that's been passed down. So it was really just about, him having these memories and me really showing the importance of collecting these stories that as we get older, like, they kind of, unless we collect them, like, they kind of just lose them to the wayside. And I feel like someone like you and I are very similar, where I think we've been, Joy Harjo, one of my favorite posts, she always says, in everyone's family, one of us has been given the responsibility to be that storyteller, the one that tells our stories. And I think, like, that's my role in this family. That's your role, like, in your
Yeah.
family. And I just think it's so cool to have that image, but then also, like, these collective stories of, like, where we've come from and what does that mean in terms of, like, these migration stories and this idea of time, like, them understanding, like, time is not linear, but it unfolds, and, like, just being in the moment and having mindfulness and being present. I guess I'll end on this one story that I always hold on to. I was thinking about it since we had our last conversation, but the biggest influence I ever had about being a father came from this construction worker that I don't know who he is, right? It was years ago. My daughters were young, real young, but I was back in New York. I was in Midtown waiting for one of my brother close friend to come down. We were gonna have lunch. So I was sitting out front of the building that he worked in. And while I'm sitting there, a couple feet away from me is this hot dog stand. There's this long line and there's, people waiting. And there's these 2 construction guys, like typical New York construction guys, thick New York accent, forearms are huge, the faded tattoos because they've been out in the sun, the
Oh,
whole
yeah.
time. And, these, like, tough looking manly kind of, like, guys. And this one guy's they're talking to each other about what they did this past weekend. And the one construction worker, he's like, he said that he, was out with his wife and they walked by this doll store. And he was like, reminding him of his daughter who's now in her 20s. And he says, when she was a little kid, we used to go to this doll store. And, you can buy dolls, you can do the doll's hair, you can buy clothes for the doll. They would do, like, these little beauty things with the doll. He was like, I would always wait outside because I hated that store. And then he told his friend, he paused from, and he told his friend what I wouldn't give to go back into that store one more time.
Oh,
And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, I was like, oh man. So like, whoever that construction worker is, I'm like, man, thank you so much for that story.
Oh,
But it's like, man, it just made me think about like just time and just, so now when my girls are getting older, I'm
mhm.
just like, whatever it is, like I invest, like, like they become a priority in that sense because just time just it goes by so fast. You know what I mean? Like I don't remember like when Kyra, my son, who's 15, I don't remember when like when he was Audrey's age, your daughter's name. I remember because I have photos, but
Mhm.
like physically, I just don't remember like because just 15 years later,
Yeah.
so it just make me be conscious just about this idea of time and just holding on to all the memories. And as a writer is really dope because I'm able to kind of like be able to articulate these stories and have them documented. If not for other folks, at least for them.
Yeah.
So when they get older, they'll be able to share these stories. I know that was a long story. I apologize.
No, that would be look.
Sorry. I know you always let me tear up, and I always get emotional when I think about that. But since our last conversation, I had forgotten that story, and then it made me think about that guy. I can still hear his voice, and like I don't remember his face, but I can remember his physical stature of just
Yeah.
him being big. And then he's told his moment. I'm like in midtime about to cry too because I'm listening to his story. I'm like, oh my gosh, like
Oh my
I'm
God.
like, man, that was so amazing the way he told
Yeah.
the story. But
Ah.
he's like, what I wouldn't give to go back into that doll store one more time.
Oh
Because time
man.
just goes by too fast. And so, those moments, like my daughters, like, they like build a bear, those kind of things. And it's the same concept, like pick your bear, pick the little heartbeat, pick the clothes. And
Yeah.
like, they wanted to go one day, and it was just like, all right, like I'm busy in a sense.
Yeah.
Like we can go another day. But then I remember that story and I was like, let's go right now. Like, let's just go.
Oh my
You
God.
know?